Sometimes the smallest moments create the biggest changes in our lives. We've all done something impulsive that we thought would be harmless fun, only to discover it changed everything. In 1847, in the frontier town of Cedar Ridge, Montana, wealthy heiress Beatrice Linton was bored with her predictable life. Mountain man Jeb Grizzly Callahan kept to himself in the wilderness. When Beatrice decided to play a simple prank on Jeb during a town gathering, she had no idea what she was about to unleash. Her innocent joke would spark a connection that neither of them saw coming. The silk handkerchief that fluttered from her hand as she sat upon the bewildered mountain man would become the first thread in a tapestry of unexpected love. But what did her playful prank actually trigger in the heart of a man who had given up on people? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn morning air carried the scent of wood smoke and fresh bread through the streets of Cedar Ridge, Montana territory. The town sat nestled in a valley where the Yellowstone River carved its way through golden aspens and towering pines. Founded just 15 years earlier by ambitious settlers seeking their fortune in the untamed West, Cedar Ridge had grown from a handful of crude cabins into a proper frontier settlement of nearly 800 souls. Main Street stretched from the river's edge to the base of the mountains, lined with wooden sidewalks that echoed under the boots of merchants, ranchers, and the occasional drifter passing through. The Cedar Ridge Bank, a two-story brick building that stood as the town's most imposing structure, anchored the commercial district. Its owner, Thomas Linton, had arrived from Philadelphia 5 years ago with enough Eastern capital to establish himself as the territory's most influential financier. Beatrice Linton pressed her face against the cool glass of her bedroom window on the bank's second floor, watching the morning bustle below with the same restless energy that had plagued her for months. At 23, she possessed the refined beauty that came from a privileged upbringing, dark auburn hair that caught the light like polished mahogany, intelligent green eyes that missed nothing, and the kind of composure that spoke of finishing, schools, and cultured conversation. Yet beneath that polished exterior burned a spirit that chafed against the constraints of her carefully orchestrated life. "Miss Beatrice, your father expects you downstairs for breakfast," came the gentle voice of Lily McKenna, her Irish maid and closest confidant. Lily had traveled west with the Lintons, trading the crowded tenements of Philadelphia for the wide skies of Montana territory. Where Beatrice was all refinement and education, Lily possessed the practical wisdom of someone who understood both worlds, the genteel society they'd left behind and the raw frontier community they now called home. "Tell father I'll be down." "Presently," Beatrice replied, though she made no move to leave the window. Below, she watched Mrs. Henderson from the general store sweep her front steps, while her husband arranged barrels of flour and sugar. The blacksmith's hammer rang out in steady rhythm, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the lowing of cattle being driven to market. This was her world now, and had been for 5 years. Yet she felt more like an observer than a participant. Her father's wealth and position provided her with comforts that most frontier women could only dream of: silk dresses imported from back east, a private tutor for French and literature, even a small piano that had survived the arduous journey over mountain passes. But comfort, she had learned, was not the same as contentment. The door opened wider, and Lily stepped into the spacious bedroom with its papered walls and Persian rug, luxuries that seemed almost absurd in a place where most folks lived in single-room cabins. "Begging your pardon, miss, but you've been staring out that window for nigh on 20 minutes. What's captured your attention so?" Beatrice sighed and turned from the window, smoothing her morning dress of deep blue wool. "The same thing that captures it every morning, Lily. Life passing me by while I watch from behind glass." Lily's expression softened with understanding. At 35, she had never married, choosing instead to remain in service to the Linton family. Yet she possessed an intuitive grasp of human nature that came from years of quiet observation. Your father means well, you know. This territory can be dangerous for a young lady of your station." "My station," Beatrice repeated with a rueful smile. "Sometimes I think my station is more of a prison than a privilege." The two women made their way downstairs to the dining room, where Thomas Linton sat reading correspondence while consuming his morning coffee and eggs. At 52, he remained a distinguished man, with silver threading through his dark hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His success in Philadelphia's banking circles had prepared him well for the challenges of frontier finance, but it had also instilled in him a natural caution when it came to protecting his investments, and his daughter was his most precious investment of all. "Good morning, Father," Beatrice said, taking her customary seat across from him at the polished mahogany table that had somehow survived the journey west intact. Thomas looked up from his papers with a warm smile that transformed his serious features. "Good morning, my dear. I trust you slept well?" "Well enough." Beatrice accepted the plate that Lily set before her, though she had little appetite. "What news from the territorial capital?" "Governor's considering statehood again, though I suspect it will be several more years before Congress acts." Thomas folded his correspondence and focused his attention on his daughter. "More interesting to me is this letter from your Aunt Margaret in Boston. She's invited you for an extended visit this winter." Beatrice's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Boston. Think of it, my dear. The theatre, the symphony, proper society again. Young men of good family and breeding." Thomas's eyes held the hopeful gleam of a father who worried his daughter was wasting her best years in a frontier settlement. "You could spend the season with Margaret, perhaps extend into spring. There's talk of several promising matches, Father." Beatrice set down her fork with more force than necessary. "We've discussed this, have we? Because I don't recall reaching any satisfactory conclusion." Thomas leaned back in his chair, assuming the patient tone he used during difficult business negotiations. "Beatrice, you're 23 years old. In Boston or Philadelphia, you'd have been married years ago to a man who could provide you with the life you deserve. And what if the life I deserve isn't the one you've imagined for me?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with months of accumulated tension. Thomas had built his fortune and reputation on careful planning and calculated risks. His daughter's restless spirit represented a variable he couldn't control, and that troubled him deeply. Lily, sensing the brewing argument, quietly excused herself to attend to other duties. She had witnessed too many of these conversations to believe this one would end differently than the others. "Beatrice," Thomas said finally, his voice gentler now, "I know you feel confined here, but you must understand. This territory is still wild, still dangerous. The kind of men you encounter here are honest, hard-working people who've built something meaningful from nothing," Beatrice finished. "Father, you've been here 5 years. Surely you can see the good in this place. In these people." Thomas gestured toward the window with a slight frown. "I see opportunity, yes, financial opportunity. But for a young woman of your education and refinement, the opportunities here are limited." It was an old argument, worn smooth by repetition. Thomas saw Cedar Ridge as a means to an end, a place to build wealth that would eventually fund a return to civilized society. Beatrice, however, had begun to see it as something more. The people here possessed a directness and authenticity that she found refreshing after years of Eastern social artifice. Women like Martha Sullivan, who owned and operated the Silver Dollar Saloon with an iron fist and a generous heart, fascinated her far more than the carefully orchestrated debutantes of her Philadelphia youth. "Perhaps," Beatrice said carefully, "my opportunities here are different than what you imagine, but no less valuable." Thomas studied his daughter's face, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw that she'd inherited from her late mother. Elizabeth Linton had possessed the same spirit, the same refusal to be contained by conventional expectations. It was what had attracted him to her 25 years ago, and what had made losing her to consumption so devastating 8 years past. "Very well," he said finally. "We'll table the discussion of Boston for now, but I want you to promise me you'll be careful in your explorations of frontier life. Some aspects of this territory are better observed from a distance." Beatrice nodded, though she made no verbal promise. They finished breakfast in companionable silence, each lost in private thoughts. Thomas returned to his correspondence, while Beatrice excused herself to take her morning walk through town. Outside, the autumn air carried a bite that promised winter's approach. Beatrice pulled her woolen shawl closer as she made her way down Main Street, nodding politely to the various merchants and residents she encountered. Most treated her with the respectful deference due the banker's daughter, but she sensed an underlying distance that money and position couldn't bridge. She paused outside Henderson's general store, drawn by the display of practical goods in the window. Work boots, heavy blankets, tools designed for hard use. These were the things that mattered here, things that served real purposes in real lives. Her silk dresses and imported tea sets seemed frivolous by comparison, beautiful but ultimately meaningless in a place where survival often depended on preparation and practical skill. "Morning, Miss Linton," called Sheriff Buck Tillman from across the street. A man in his 40s with graying temples and the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen enough violence to appreciate peace, Buck had earned the respect of Cedar Ridge through his fair dealing and steady nerves. "Fine morning for a walk." "Indeed." "It is, Sheriff. Any interesting news from your rounds?" Buck ambled over, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Heard tell that Grizzly Callahan's coming down from the high country today." "Been near 2 months since he's shown his face in town." Beatrice felt a flutter of curiosity at the mention of the legendary mountain man. Jeb Grizzly Callahan had become something of a local legend in the 5 years she'd lived in Cedar Ridge, though she'd seen him perhaps half a dozen times and never up close. The stories about him varied depending on the teller. Some claimed he could track a mouse through a snowstorm. Others insisted he'd once killed a grizzly bear with nothing but a hunting knife. What everyone agreed on was that he preferred the solitude of the mountains to the company of townspeople, descending only when necessity demanded supplies he couldn't make or find himself. "Will he be staying long?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Buck chuckled. "With Grizzly, you never can tell. Sometimes he's in and out in an hour, sometimes he'll stick around for a day or two. Depends on his mood and whether Martha's got any of that apple pie he's partial to." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of hoofbeats echoed down Main Street. Beatrice turned to see a lone rider approaching on a sturdy mountain horse, and even at a distance, she knew it had to be Callahan. There was something in the way he sat his saddle, alert but relaxed, that spoke of someone completely at home in the wilderness. As he drew closer, she found herself studying him with unexpected intensity. Jeb Callahan was a large man, perhaps 6 feet and more, with the kind of broad shoulders and powerful build that came from years of physical labor in unforgiving country. His dark hair hung past his collar, and a full beard covered the lower half of his face. He dressed practically in worn leather and wool, with the kind of hat that had seen weather and wear. Everything about him spoke of capability and self-reliance. What surprised her most, however, was his eyes. Even from a distance, she could see they held an intelligence and depth that contradicted the popular image of mountain men as simple, uneducated hermits. There was something almost scholarly in his bearing, despite his rugged appearance. He dismounted outside Henderson's store with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot, and Beatrice found herself wondering about his story. What had driven a man to seek such complete solitude? What experiences had shaped him into someone who chose the company of mountains over people? "You're staring, miss," Buck observed with gentle amusement. Beatrice felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I was merely curious about someone who's become such a local legend." "Jeb's a good man," Buck said seriously. "Keeps to himself mostly, but he's helped out when folks needed it. Tracked down the Henderson boy when he got lost in that blizzard 3 winters back. Helped old Pete Morrison get his cattle through. The pass, when the regular trails washed out. He's not the wild man some folks make him out to be. As if sensing their attention, Jeb Callahan looked in their direction. His gaze swept over Buck with a nod of acknowledgement, then settled briefly. On Beatrice, even at a distance, she felt the impact of those intelligent eyes, and something stirred in her chest. Curiosity, certainly, but something deeper as well. Then the moment passed, and he disappeared into the general store, leaving Beatrice with an odd sense of anticipation she couldn't quite name. As she continued her walk through town, she found herself thinking about those eyes and the story they might hold, unaware that within hours, her impulsive nature would create a connection that would change both their lives forever. The harvest. Festival preparations had transformed Cedar Ridge's town square into a bustling center of activity. Colorful bunting stretched between buildings, and the scent of roasted corn and apple cider filled the crisp afternoon air. Tables groaned under the weight of preserves, fresh bread and pies donated by the town's women, while children darted between the adults with the infectious energy of a community celebration. Beatrice stood near the edge of the festivities, watching. The easy camaraderie between neighbors, with a mixture of longing and detachment. Her father had reluctantly agreed to let her attend, though he'd insisted on proper supervision. Lily hovered nearby, keeping a watchful eye while attempting to appear casual about it. "Ladies and gentlemen," called out Mayor Jameson, a portly man whose enthusiasm for public speaking far exceeded his talent for it. "We're about to begin our traditional harvest demonstration. As you know, each year we celebrate the strength and skill that built our fine community." A cheer went up from the crowd as several local men stepped forward to participate in various contests of strength and ability. Beatrice recognized most of them, ranchers and shopkeepers who formed the backbone of Cedar Ridge society. Then her attention was caught by a familiar figure emerging from the crowd. Jeb Callahan moved with quiet confidence, seemingly unaware of the ripple of interest his presence created. He'd removed his hat, revealing dark hair that caught glints of auburn. In the afternoon sun, without the shadows that typically obscured his features, Beatrice could see the strong line of his jaw beneath his beard and the intelligent eyes that had intrigued her that morning. "Well, I'll be," muttered old Pete Morrison, loud enough for half the square to hear. "Grizzly's actually going to participate this year." Mayor Jameson seemed momentarily flustered by this unexpected development, but quickly recovered his composure. "Excellent, excellent. Mr. Callahan, we're honored by your participation. The demonstration involves tests of practical frontier skills: log, lifting, horseshoe throwing, and target shooting." Jeb nodded silently, his presence adding an element of authentic frontier capability that the other participants, for all their good intentions, couldn't match. This wasn't a shopkeeper playing at being rugged. This was a man who lived the frontier life every day. The first event involved lifting progressively heavier logs, and the local men took turns demonstrating their strength to appreciative applause. When Jeb's turn came, he approached the heaviest log that had defeated the previous contestants. Without apparent effort, he lifted it clear of the ground and held it steady, drawing genuine admiration from the crowd. "Remarkable," breathed Dr. Coleman, the town's physician. "The man's strength is extraordinary." As Jeb set the log down with controlled precision, something unexpected happened. Perhaps it was the combination of the festive atmosphere, her father's morning lecture about proper young men and suitable matches, or simply the restless energy that had been building in her for months. Whatever the cause, Beatrice found herself seized by an impulse that would have horrified her Philadelphia finishing school instructors. Before rational thought could intervene, she stepped forward from the crowd and, with the kind of mischievous smile that had gotten her into trouble as a child, plopped herself down directly on the log that Jeb had just set down. The same log he was now bending to lift again. The effect was immediate and electric. The crowd fell silent, then erupted in a mixture of gasps, nervous laughter, and shocked exclamations. Lily's face went pale as she realized what her charge had done. Mayor Jameson stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. But it was Jeb's reaction that truly mattered, and it surprised everyone, most of all Beatrice herself. Instead of the embarrassment or anger she might have expected, something shifted in his expression. His eyes widened, not with shock but with something deeper. Surprise, certainly, but also a flicker of warmth that suggested he found her impulsive act more delightful than scandalous. "Well," he said quietly, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "That only she was close enough to hear, I suppose that makes this a bit more challenging." The crowd held its collective breath as Jeb positioned himself to lift the log, with Beatrice still perched on it. She found herself looking directly into his face, close enough to see the laugh lines around his eyes and catch the scent of pine and leather that clung to his clothes. "Hold on," he murmured, and she felt his hands brace against the log on either side of her. What happened next would be talked about in Cedar Ridge for years to come. Jeb Callahan, the solitary mountain man who avoided social contact, lifted not just the heavy log, but the banker's daughter as well, raising them both above his head with the same controlled strength he'd shown before. But more than that, something in his expression had changed, softened, awakened. As he held them aloft, Beatrice's silk handkerchief, the one she'd been nervously twisting in her hands, fluttered free and drifted down to land at his feet. The delicate square of fabric, embroidered with her initials in careful script, seemed almost absurdly fragile against the rough ground of the town square. "Miss Linton," he said quietly, as he slowly lowered the log, his voice holding a note she'd never heard before. Something between wonder and concern. The moment her feet touched the ground, reality crashed back over both of them. The crowd's murmur grew louder, a mix of delighted scandal and genuine shock. Beatrice realized she was standing far closer to Jeb than propriety allowed, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes and feel the warmth radiating from his powerful frame. She started to speak but found herself unexpectedly breathless. Jeb bent to retrieve her fallen handkerchief, and as he straightened, something fell from his pocket. A small brass compass that landed with a soft clink on the wooden boards of the demonstration platform. Both of them stared at it for a moment, as if recognizing that something fundamental had shifted in their carefully ordered worlds. "Your handkerchief, Miss Linton," Jeb said formally, though his voice held an undertone that suggested nothing about this moment was formal at all. As she reached for it, their fingers brushed briefly, and Beatrice felt something electric pass between them. Judging by the way his breath caught, he felt it too. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan," she managed to say, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. The spell was broken by the arrival of her father, who pushed through the crowd with an expression that promised serious consequences. Thomas Linton's face was flushed with anger and embarrassment, and his eyes held the kind of fury that suggested this incident would have lasting repercussions. "Beatrice," he said, in a voice tight with controlled rage, "we're leaving now." But as she allowed herself to be escorted away by her mortified father, Beatrice couldn't help but glance back at Jeb. He stood motionless in the center of the square, her handkerchief still in his hand, watching her departure with an expression that spoke of profound confusion and something deeper, something that looked remarkably like longing. The brass compass lay forgotten at his feet, as if both of them had lost their sense of direction in that single impulsive moment. Sheriff Buck Tillman broke the spell by stepping forward to help disperse the crowd. "Show's over, folks. Let's give everyone some breathing room." As the townspeople slowly returned to their festival activities, their conversations buzzed with speculation about what they'd witnessed. Some saw it as a harmless prank by a bored rich girl. Others recognized it as something more significant, the moment when two very different worlds had collided in the most unexpected way possible. Jeb finally bent to pick up his compass, but his movement seemed mechanical, as if his thoughts were elsewhere entirely. Martha Sullivan, the saloon owner, who'd known him longer than most, approached with her usual direct manner. "Well," she said, crossing her arms and studying his face, "that was interesting." Jeb looked at her with the expression of a man who'd just discovered that everything he thought he knew about himself might be wrong. "Yeah," he said quietly, tucking the compass back into his pocket. "Interesting." But as he watched Beatrice disappear around the corner with her father, still clutching his retrieved handkerchief, Jeb Callahan realized that interesting hardly began to describe what had just happened to his carefully controlled world. The next morning brought no relief from the storm that had erupted in the Linton household. Beatrice sat in her father's study, her hands folded in her lap, while Thomas paced behind his mahogany desk like a caged bear. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed to mock the tension that filled the room. "I simply cannot comprehend. What possessed you?" Thomas said for the third time, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining control. "In front of the entire town, Beatrice. The entire town." Beatrice kept her gaze fixed on her hands, though inwardly she felt no real remorse for her impulsive act. If anything, the memory of those few moments, the strength in Jeb's arms, the unexpected warmth in his eyes, the electric touch of their fingers, had only grown stronger overnight. "I meant no harm, Father. It was simply a moment of spontaneity." "Spontaneity?" Thomas stopped pacing and stared at her with genuine bewilderment. "Beatrice, you compromised yourself publicly with a man who lives like a hermit in the wilderness. Do you have any idea what people are saying?" Before she could answer, Lily knocked softly and entered with the morning tea service. Her Irish eyes were sympathetic as she set the tray on the side table, though she said nothing about the gossip that was undoubtedly circulating through town like wildfire. "Perhaps," Beatrice said carefully, "people are saying less than you imagine." Thomas resumed his pacing. "Mrs. Coleman stopped me outside the bank this morning to express her concern about your welfare. Mayor Jameson felt compelled to assure me that such spirited behavior was perfectly natural for a young woman of your energy. Even Sheriff Tillman went out of his way to mention that mountain men, despite their reputation, are generally harmless to respectable ladies." The patronizing nature of these well-meaning comments made Beatrice's jaw tighten. "How kind of them to reassure you about my encounter with a dangerous wild man." "This is not amusing, Beatrice." Thomas sat heavily in his chair and rubbed his temples. "I've worked for 5 years to establish our family's reputation in this territory. Our standing in the community affects every business relationship I've built." For the first time, Beatrice looked directly at her father, seeing the genuine worry beneath his anger. "Father, surely one impulsive moment cannot undo 5 years of solid business practices. One moment can change everything in a small community." "Like this," Thomas replied grimly. "Reputation is currency here, perhaps more so than in Philadelphia. And yours, my dear daughter, has been significantly devalued." The word stung, though Beatrice tried not to show it. She rose from her chair and moved to the window, where she could see the familiar bustle of Main Street below. "So, what would you have me do? Pretend it never happened? Issue a public apology for a moment of harmless fun? I would have you confined to this house until the gossip dies down and people forget about your interaction with Mr. Callahan." Beatrice turned from the window, her eyes flashing with indignation. "Confined? Father, I'm 23 years old, not a wayward child." "Then perhaps it's time you stopped acting like one." The words hung between them like a challenge, and for a moment neither spoke. Finally, Thomas's expression softened slightly. "Beatrice, I know you find life here restrictive, but there are proper ways to seek excitement, appropriate ways to meet suitable young men. What you did yesterday was neither proper nor appropriate." "And what if proper and appropriate aren't what I want anymore?" The question seemed to echo. In the room's silence, Thomas stared at his daughter as if seeing a stranger, while Beatrice felt the weight of her own words. She hadn't planned to say it, but once spoken, she realized it was the truth she'd been avoiding for months. "Then you need time to reconsider what you do want," Thomas said finally. "You're not to leave this house without my explicit permission and proper supervision. Lily will accompany you on any necessary errands, and you will not venture beyond Main Street under any circumstances." Beatrice felt the walls of her gilded cage closing tighter around her. "For how long?" "Until I'm satisfied that this fascination with frontier wildness has passed." After her father dismissed her, Beatrice spent the afternoon in her room, staring out at the mountains that surrounded their valley. Somewhere up there, Jeb Callahan was living the kind of free, authentic life that called to something deep in her spirit. The thought of him moving through the wilderness with complete self-reliance both thrilled and intimidated her. As evening approached, she made a decision that would have shocked her father, but felt completely natural to her rebellious heart. If she was to be confined like a child, then perhaps it was time to prove she was capable of more than he imagined. She waited until the household had settled for the night, then quietly gathered a few supplies and slipped out through the kitchen. A door. Her expensive Eastern riding boots, made of soft leather and designed more for appearance than practicality, made soft sounds on the wooden steps. But she managed to reach the street without alerting anyone to her departure. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate the familiar streets, though shadows seemed deeper and more mysterious than they did during the day. Beatrice pulled her cloak closer and headed toward the edge of town, where the wilderness began and civilization ended. She had no clear plan beyond finding Jeb and apologizing for any embarrassment her impulsive prank might have caused him. It seemed important to explain that she hadn't meant to make him a subject of town gossip, that her action had been spontaneous rather than calculated. The trail that led into the foothills was well marked, used by hunters and trappers who worked the lower elevations. Beatrice had never ventured beyond its beginning, but something about the moonlit landscape made her feel bold and capable. Her riding boots, however, proved less than ideal for wilderness navigation. Within a few hundred yards, she could feel pebbles working their way inside, and the smooth soles provided little traction on the rocky path. She had been walking for perhaps an hour, guided more by determination than by any real sense of direction, when she heard the sound of an approaching horse. Her heart quickened, with fear or anticipation she couldn't be sure, and she stepped behind a large boulder to observe the rider. Even in moonlight she recognized Jeb's powerful silhouette and the steady gait of his mountain horse. He was heading back toward town, probably returning from checking traps or gathering supplies from some hidden cache. The sight of him moving through his natural element with such quiet confidence made her breath catch before she could lose her nerve. She stepped out from behind the boulder. "Mr. Callahan!" The horse stopped immediately, and she heard Jeb's sharp intake of breath. For a moment, neither moved, and she wondered if he might simply ride past her as if she were a ghost or figment of imagination. "Miss Linton," he said finally, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, "what in God's name are you doing out here?" There was concern in his tone rather than anger, which gave her courage to step closer. "I came to apologize for yesterday, for any trouble my foolishness might have caused you." Jeb dismounted and moved toward her, his movements careful and deliberate. "You came into the wilderness alone, at night, to apologize." When he put it like that, it did sound rather foolish. "Perhaps my planning could have been better." "Perhaps," he agreed, and she caught what might have been amusement in his voice. "Miss Linton, these mountains can be dangerous even for experienced travelers. For a young lady in—" He glanced down at her impractical footwear. "Riding boots, it's considerably more hazardous." Beatrice felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the cool air. "I realize my equipment isn't ideal. Your equipment isn't suitable for a garden party, let alone a mountain trail." But there was gentleness in his criticism, and when he continued, his voice held a note of something that sounded almost like admiration. "Though I have to say, Miss Linton, you've got more backbone than most folks give you credit for." The unexpected compliment made her smile. Please call me Beatrice. After yesterday's unconventional introduction, I think we can dispense with excessive formality. Beatrice, he repeated, as if testing how her name sounded in his voice. And I'm Jeb, though I suspect you already knew that. Everyone knows about the legendary Grizzly Callahan, she said with a teasing smile. Though I'm beginning to suspect the legends might not tell the whole story. In the moonlight, she saw his eyebrows rise slightly. What makes you say that? A truly wild mountain man wouldn't be concerned about a foolish young woman wandering alone in the dark. He'd probably assume she deserved whatever fate befell her. Jeb was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the silver light. Maybe the mountain man in question has more civilized instincts than people assume. Or maybe, Beatrice said softly, he's not as wild as he pretends to be. The observation seemed to hit home because Jeb's expression shifted subtly. For just a moment, she glimpsed something behind his carefully maintained facade, something that spoke of education, refinement, and a past that didn't match his current hermit existence. We should get you back to town, he said finally. Your father's probably discovered you're missing by now, and I'd rather not be accused of kidnapping the banker's daughter. As he helped her up onto his horse, his hands strong and steady around her waist, Beatrice realized that her impulsive midnight journey had accomplished far more than a simple apology. She'd seen something in Jeb Callahan that intrigued her even more than his reputation. She'd seen the complex, intelligent man hiding behind the mountain man legend, and judging by the careful way he settled her in the saddle and the protective instincts he'd shown, she suspected her unconventional prank had awakened something in him as well. 3 days after Jeb had safely delivered Beatrice back to her father's house, an encounter that had resulted in a lecture of epic proportions. From Thomas Linton, she found herself slipping out the back door of the Silver Dollar Saloon at dawn. Martha Sullivan had agreed to teach her what she called practical frontier skills, though she'd made it clear that such lessons came with certain conditions. First thing you need to understand, Martha had said the previous evening when Beatrice had approached her with the unusual request, is that frontier life isn't some romantic adventure. It's hard work, and it can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. Martha Sullivan was a woman who commanded respect in Cedar Ridge through competence rather than social position. At 45, she'd buried 2 husbands, raised 3 children to adulthood, and built the most successful saloon in the territory. Her hands were calloused from real work, her manner direct, and her tolerance for foolishness limited. I understand that, Beatrice had replied, but I need to learn. I need to know that I could survive here without relying entirely on my father's protection. Martha had studied her for a long moment, perhaps recognizing something genuine beneath the request. All right then. But we do this my way, and you don't quit halfway through when you realize it's not as romantic as you imagined. Now, standing behind the saloon in the pre-dawn darkness, Beatrice wondered if she'd bitten off more than she could chew. Martha emerged from the building carrying an armload of supplies, rope, tools, and what appeared to be a very dead chicken. First lesson, Martha announced without preamble, is learning to prepare food properly. City folks tend to think meat appears magically in tidy packages. Out here, if you want to eat, you need to know the whole process. The next hour was simultaneously educational and humbling. Martha demonstrated how to pluck and clean the chicken with efficient, practiced movements, explaining each step in matter-of-fact terms. When Beatrice's turn came, her inexperience was painfully obvious. You're holding the knife like it might bite you, Martha observed. A tool is only as good as the person using it. Respect it, don't fear it. By the time the sun was fully up, Beatrice's expensive dress was stained beyond repair. Her hands were covered in scratches and chicken feathers, and she felt more accomplished than she had in months. There was something deeply satisfying about completing a task that served a real purpose, even if that task was messy and undignified by Philadelphia standards. Tomorrow we'll work on fire building and basic cooking, Martha said as she surveyed. Beatrice's bedraggled appearance. Might want to wear something you can actually work in. I don't own anything I can work in, Beatrice admitted. Martha snorted with amusement. Well then, I guess we'll have to remedy that situation. An hour later, Beatrice stood in Henderson's general store wearing a practical wool dress that Martha had somehow procured, along with sturdy boots that actually fit her feet properly. The transformation was remarkable. She looked less like a banker's pampered daughter and more like someone who belonged in frontier Montana. Miss Linton, the surprised voice belonged to Dr. Coleman's wife, who had just entered the store with her own shopping list. My goodness, I hardly recognized you. Before Beatrice could respond, the door opened again and Jeb Callahan stepped inside. He'd clearly come to town for supplies, carrying a leather satchel and wearing the same practical clothing she'd seen him in before. But when his eyes fell on her, his expression shifted to something between surprise and approval. Miss Linton, he said quietly, touching the brim of his hat. You look different. Different good or different bad? She asked, surprising herself with her directness. Different, like you're ready for whatever comes next, he replied, and something in his tone suggested he found this change intriguing rather than shocking. Mrs. Coleman cleared her throat disapprovingly. Miss Linton, I do hope you're not planning to make a habit of this practical attire. What would people think? They might think I'm learning to take care of myself, Beatrice replied calmly, though she felt a flutter of nervousness at speaking so boldly in front of Jeb Henderson. Sensing potential conflict between his customers, quickly intervened. Miss Linton's been helping Martha with some cooking projects. Nothing wrong with a young lady learning useful skills. Jeb had been examining some rope on a nearby shelf, but Beatrice caught him glancing in her direction several times. Finally, he approached the counter where she stood waiting for Henderson to tally her purchases. Learning to cook, are you? He asked quietly, so that Mrs. Coleman couldn't overhear. Among other things, Beatrice replied. Martha's teaching me practical skills, how to prepare food, build fires, basic survival knowledge. That's unexpected, Jeb said, though his tone suggested he approved of the unexpected. Most ladies of your position wouldn't be interested in such things. Maybe I'm not like most ladies of my position. The words hung between them, carrying more weight than a simple statement about cooking lessons. Jeb studied her face with those intelligent eyes, and she had the impression he was seeing her clearly for the first time. Not as the banker's pampered daughter playing at frontier life, but as someone genuinely seeking to understand and adapt. To this world, no, he said finally, his voice so quiet only she could hear. I don't think you are. Before either could say more, the door burst open and Thomas Linton strode in, his face flushed with anger and exertion. He'd clearly been searching for his daughter, and finding her in the general store, wearing practical clothing, while conversing with Jeb Callahan, was not improving his mood. Beatrice, he said in the carefully controlled tone she'd learned to recognize as a sign of serious trouble. I've been looking for you. We need to have a conversation. Good morning, Father, she replied calmly, though her heart was racing. I was just purchasing some supplies. Thomas's gaze took in her changed appearance and the practical goods she'd selected. I can see that. The question is why you're purchasing. Supplies for activities I specifically forbade. The entire store had fallen silent. Henderson pretended to be organizing inventory, Mrs. Coleman made no pretense of not listening, and Jeb had gone very still beside her. I'm learning skills that might prove useful, Beatrice said carefully. Useful for what? You have no need for such rustic accomplishments. Before Beatrice could respond, Jeb stepped forward slightly. His movement was subtle, but it placed him in a position where he could intervene if Thomas became more aggressive. Mr. Linton, Jeb said quietly, his voice respectful but firm. With respect, knowing how to take care of oneself is never a bad thing, especially in territory like this. Thomas turned his attention to Jeb with the kind of cold fury that had intimidated business competitors across 2 territories. "Mr. Callahan, I don't recall asking for your opinion on how to raise my daughter." "You didn't ask," Jeb agreed calmly, "but she's old enough to make her own decisions about what she wants to learn." The tension in the store became almost unbearable. Two very different men, representing two very different ways of life, faced each other across a philosophical divide that seemed unbridgeable. "Is she?" Thomas asked icily. "Because it seems to me that her recent decisions have shown a troubling lack of judgment." Beatrice felt her cheeks burn. But before she could respond, Jeb reached into his pocket and withdrew something small. He held it out to her, a wooden carving no bigger than her palm, shaped like a small bear. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with tiny details that spoke of hours of careful work. "I made this for you," he said simply, "as an apology for any trouble my participation in the harvest demonstration might have caused." The gift was unexpected and touching, clearly the work of skilled hands and considerable time. But more than that, it was a gesture that spoke of thought, consideration, and something deeper than casual acquaintance. Beatrice accepted the carved bear with hands that trembled slightly. "It's beautiful, Jeb. Thank you." The use of his first name in front of her father was perhaps unwise, but Beatrice found she didn't care. The little wooden bear seemed to represent something important, proof that their encounter had meant something to him as well, that she hadn't imagined the connection between them. Thomas's face had gone white with barely controlled rage. "Beatrice, we're leaving now." As he escorted her from the store with a grip on her arm that would leave bruises, Beatrice clutched the wooden bear and caught one last glimpse of Jeb. He was watching their departure with an expression that combined concern, frustration, and something that looked remarkably like determination. She had the distinct impression that this confrontation had only strengthened whatever was growing between them, and that her father's attempts to keep them apart might have the opposite effect of what he intended. The confrontation at Henderson's General Store marked a turning point in the delicate dance between Beatrice and her father. For the next week, Thomas had restricted her movements even further, insisting that Lily accompany her everywhere and forbidding any contact with Martha Sullivan's practical education program. But he hadn't counted on his daughter's growing determination or her newfound allies in unexpected places. It was Sheriff Buck Tillman who provided the opportunity for what would become the most revealing conversation of Beatrice's life. He arrived at the bank on a Thursday morning with news that would change everything. Claimed jumpers had been spotted in the northern valleys, and the territorial authorities were requesting local assistance in tracking their movements. "I need someone who knows the high country," Buck explained to Thomas in the bank's main office. "Someone who can read sign and move quietly through terrain most folks can't navigate." "Surely you have local men with such skills," Thomas replied, though Beatrice could see he already suspected where this conversation was heading. "Some, yes, but none with Jeb Callahan's experience. The man spent 3 years as a scout for the army before he took to the mountains. If these claim jumpers are planning to work the northern valleys, Jeb's the best chance we have of finding them before they cause real trouble." Beatrice, who had been reading quietly in the corner of the office, looked up with sudden interest. The mention of Jeb's military service was the first concrete information she'd heard about his past, and it explained much about his bearing and competence. "Mr. Callahan struck me as someone who preferred solitude to civic duty," Thomas said carefully. Buck chuckled. "Oh, Jeb's not much for civic duty, that's true. But he's got a strong sense of justice, and he doesn't like seeing honest folks threatened. I suspect he'll help, but it might take some convincing." After Buck left, Beatrice found herself consumed with curiosity about this new information. Jeb Callahan had been an army scout. That meant education, training, and a past that involved far more civilization than his current hermit existence suggested. What had happened to drive such a man into complete isolation? Her opportunity to learn more came 2 days later, when Martha Sullivan appeared at the bank's rear entrance with a message that would have scandalized Thomas if he'd known about it. "Your mountain man friend is holed up at the old Morrison cabin," Martha whispered to Beatrice during a brief moment when Lily was distracted. "Buck asked him to scout the northern valleys, but he's been acting strange ever since. Thought you might want to know." The Morrison cabin sat on an abandoned homestead about 2 miles from town, a place where Pete Morrison had tried and failed to establish a ranch before giving up and moving closer to Cedar Ridge's main settlement. It was isolated enough to provide the solitude Jeb preferred, but close enough to town to serve as a base of operations. Beatrice knew she was taking an enormous risk by slipping away to find him, but something in Martha's description of his strange behavior worried her. She waited until evening, when her father was occupied with ledgers and correspondence, then told Lily she was retiring early with a headache. The moonlit ride to the Morrison cabin tested every skill Martha had taught her about moving quietly through unfamiliar terrain. Her practical clothing and sturdy boots made the journey possible, though she still felt clumsy compared to someone like Jeb, who moved through the wilderness as if he belonged there. The cabin showed signs of recent occupation, smoke rising from the chimney, a horse tethered nearby, and light visible through the single window. Beatrice approached carefully, unsure of her reception, but determined to satisfy her curiosity about this complex man who had begun to occupy so many of her thoughts. She found Jeb sitting at a rough wooden table, writing by lamplight in what appeared to be a leather-bound journal. The sight was so unexpected, the rugged mountain man engaged in the gentle occupation of writing, that she stood frozen in the doorway, uncertain whether to announce herself or retreat. He looked up at her arrival, and she was struck by the expression of profound sadness in his eyes. This wasn't the confident, competent man she'd encountered before. This was someone wrestling with memories that caused him genuine pain. "Beatrice," he said quietly, setting down his pen, "what are you doing here? Martha said you were acting strangely. I was concerned." She stepped inside without invitation, drawn by an instinct that told her he needed companionship more than solitude at this moment. "You rode out here alone at night because you were concerned about my mood." The question made her realize how impulsive and potentially dangerous her action had been, but she refused to show embarrassment. "Yes." Jeb stared at her for a long moment, then gestured to a second chair at the table. "You might as well sit. And down, though I should warn you, I'm not particularly good company tonight." As she settled across from him, Beatrice could see the open journal contained careful handwriting that spoke of education and refinement. The pages were filled with observations about weather, wildlife, and what appeared to be personal reflections, written in the measured prose of someone accustomed to expressing complex thoughts. "You keep a journal," she observed. "Old habit from my army days. Started as a way to record scout reports, became a way to—" He trailed off as if uncertain how to explain. "A way to what?" "A way to remember that I used to be someone different." He closed the journal carefully, but not before she caught a glimpse of a small photograph tucked between the pages. A woman and young child, both smiling at the camera with the kind of happiness that spoke of a life filled with love and hope. The deep silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and carefully guarded pain. Finally, Beatrice found the courage to speak. "The photograph," she said gently. "Your family?" Jeb's hands stilled on the journal cover. For a moment she thought he might refuse to answer, might retreat behind the wall of silence that had protected him for so long. Instead, he opened the journal again and carefully withdrew the photograph, holding it so she could see it clearly. "My wife, Sarah," he said quietly, "and my daughter, Emma. She would have been 8 years old this past spring." The past tense hit Beatrice like a physical blow. Would have been? Cholera epidemic, summer of 1844. "I was away on a scouting mission for 6 weeks. When I came back—" His voice broke slightly, and he carefully returned the photograph to the journal. The whole settlement was gone. 43 people, including everyone I'd ever loved. Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes as understanding. flooded through her. This explained everything. His retreat from civilization, his preference for solitude, his careful distance from emotional connection. He wasn't a wild mountain man by nature. He was a broken man who'd lost everything that mattered to him. "Jeb," she whispered, reaching across the table to cover his hand with hers. "I'm so sorry. I was a teacher before I joined the army," he continued, as if her touch had unlocked something he'd kept buried for years. "Taught in a little school in Ohio, married my childhood sweetheart, thought I had my whole life planned out. Then the war with Mexico came, and I signed up thinking it would be an adventure, a chance to serve my country and see something of the world. But it wasn't an adventure. No. It was brutal and pointless, and it changed me in ways I didn't understand until I came home. Sarah tried to help me adjust, tried to understand why I couldn't settle back into teaching arithmetic to farm children. The army offered me a position as a scout, good pay, and the kind of work that suited what I'd become. I thought it would be temporary, just until I could find my footing again." Beatrice squeezed his hand gently, offering what comfort she could as he continued his painful story. "Sarah supported my decision, even though it meant long separations. She said she'd rather have me happy and away than miserable and home every night. Emma was just learning to read when I left for what turned out to be my final mission." "You blame yourself," Beatrice said, recognizing the guilt that colored every word. "If I'd been there, maybe I could have gotten them to safety. Maybe I could have found medicine, or at least been with them at the end. Instead, they died alone while I was tracking horse thieves through country that didn't matter to anyone but the men who paid my wages." The raw pain in his voice made Beatrice's heart ache. She could see now why he'd chosen the mountains over civilization, why he'd built walls around his emotions that seemed impenetrable. He'd loved completely and lost everything, and the prospect of risking such pain again would terrify anyone. "So you came to the mountains to hide," she said softly. "I came to the mountains to forget," he corrected. "But forgetting turned out to be impossible. The journal helps me remember them properly, not just the ending, but all the good years before. And now Sheriff Tillman is asking you to scout again. That's why you've been strange. It's bringing back memories you'd rather not face." Jeb nodded. "Slowly. 3 years of mountain solitude, and the first time someone asks me to use my old skills, everything comes flooding back. Not just the technical knowledge, but the sense of responsibility to other people. The fear that if I get involved, I might fail them the way I failed Sarah and Emma." Beatrice sat quietly for a moment, processing this revelation and understanding. For the first time, the depth of complexity beneath Jeb's hermit facade. He wasn't a simple mountain man avoiding civilization. He was an educated, capable man running from the possibility of caring about anyone enough to risk losing them. "What if," she said carefully, "instead of thinking about what you lost, you considered what you might be able to protect? Buck needs your skills because honest folks are being threatened. Maybe this is a chance to use your experience to make sure other families don't suffer what yours did." Jeb looked at her with something approaching wonder. "You have an interesting way of looking at things, Beatrice Linton. I have a practical way of looking at things. Martha's been teaching me that life isn't about avoiding risk. It's about deciding which risks are worth taking. And what risks do you think are worth taking?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far, beyond the immediate discussion of claim jumpers and civic duty. Beatrice felt her pulse quicken as she realized they were no longer talking about his past or Buck's request for help. "I think," she said carefully, "that some connections between people are worth the risk of pain. That cutting yourself off from all possibility of happiness doesn't honor the people you've lost. It just wastes the life they would have wanted you to live." Jeb stared at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. A crack in the wall he'd built around his heart, a glimmer of hope struggling against years of carefully maintained despair. "You're a remarkable woman, Beatrice," he said finally. "Your father has no idea what kind of strength he's trying to contain." "Maybe it's time he learned," she replied, surprising herself with her boldness. As if her words had broken some invisible barrier between them, Jeb reached across the table to touch her face gently. "And maybe it's time I stopped hiding from the possibility that life might still hold something worth caring about." When he kissed her, soft and tentative at first, then with growing warmth and certainty, Beatrice felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of herself and what she wanted from life. This wasn't the pampered existence her father had planned for her, or the safe, predictable marriage to an Eastern gentleman that represented security and social position. This was something real and risky, and completely beyond her previous experience. The beginning of a love that would require courage, compromise, and a willingness to build a new life from the foundation of two very different worlds. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Jeb rested his forehead against hers. "Your father's going to want to kill me," he murmured. "Let me worry about my father," Beatrice replied. "The question is, are you going to help Buck with these claim jumpers?" "I think," Jeb said, his voice stronger and more certain than it had been all evening, "it might be time for me to remember that I used to be good at protecting people." The news of Jeb's agreement to help track the claim jumpers spread through Cedar Ridge with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. By the following afternoon, Beatrice could see the change in how people looked at him when he appeared on Main Street. No longer was he simply the mysterious hermit from the mountains. He was a man stepping forward to protect their community, and that transformation carried weight in a frontier settlement where mutual dependence often meant the difference between survival and disaster. Beatrice watched from her bedroom window as Jeb met with Sheriff Tillman and Mayor Jameson outside the jail. Even at a distance, she could see the change in his bearing. The man who had sat across from her the previous evening, wrestling with painful memories and self-doubt, had been replaced by someone who moved with purpose and quiet authority. "Miss Beatrice," Lily said softly from behind her, "your father's asking for you downstairs. He seems agitated about something." Beatrice sighed and turned from the window, though not before catching one last glimpse of Jeb as he mounted his horse. The sight of him preparing to ride into potential danger made something clench tight in her chest, a feeling she was beginning to recognize as the fear that comes with caring deeply about someone whose life involves genuine risk. She found her father in his study, pacing behind his desk with the restless energy of a man whose carefully ordered world was spinning beyond his control. When she entered, he fixed her with a look that suggested he knew exactly where she'd been the previous evening. "Sit down, Beatrice. We need to discuss your recent activities." "What activities would those be, Father?" Thomas stopped pacing and faced her directly. "Don't insult my intelligence. Half the town saw you returning from the Morrison cabin at dawn yesterday. The other half heard about it from the first half by noon." Beatrice felt her cheeks warm, but she met her father's gaze steadily. "I visited Jeb because Martha was concerned about his state of mind. It seemed like the neighborly thing to do." "Neighborly," Thomas repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Beatrice, you spent the evening alone with an unmarried man in an isolated cabin. By any reasonable standard of propriety, your reputation is now thoroughly compromised." "My reputation seems to survive each new supposed scandal remarkably well. This time is different." Thomas resumed his pacing, his agitation obvious. "This time, people are talking about more than just impulsive pranks or unconventional clothing. Choices. They're talking about serious impropriety, and some are suggesting that perhaps Mr. Callahan should do the honorable thing and make an honest woman of you." The suggestion hit Beatrice like cold water. "People are talking about marriage. Dr. Coleman cornered me outside the bank this morning to express his concern about your welfare," Mrs. Henderson felt compelled to mention that her own daughter would never dream of such behavior. Even Sheriff Tillman, who generally minds his own business, suggested that maybe it was time for you to consider settling down with someone who could guide your energies in more appropriate directions. Beatrice stared at her father, appalled by the presumption of people who felt entitled to manage her personal affairs based on gossip and speculation. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them that my daughter's future was a family matter and none of their concern. But Beatrice, the damage is done. Your behavior has created a situation where people expect consequences, and if those consequences don't materialize naturally, they'll likely take steps to encourage them." Before Beatrice could respond, a commotion in the street drew their attention. To the window, a group of men had gathered outside the bank, and their voices carried the urgent tone of people sharing alarming news. Thomas opened the window to hear better, and the words that drifted up made both of them freeze. "Found evidence of a camp about 10 miles north of here. At least 8 men, maybe more. Jeb says they've been watching the town for days." Thomas's face went pale. "Claim jumpers," he muttered. "They've been surveying our area." The implications were immediately clear to anyone who understood frontier economics. Claim jumpers weren't simply opportunistic thieves. They were organized criminals who identified valuable properties, then used intimidation, violence, and legal manipulation to drive out legitimate owners and claim the land for themselves. A group of 8 or more men suggested this was a serious, well-planned operation. "We need to organize the town's defense," Thomas said, his banker's mind already shifting to practical considerations. "Secure the most valuable properties, coordinate with Sheriff Tillman." He was interrupted by a knock on the front door. Lily's voice carried up the stairs as she admitted someone, followed by the sound of boots on hardwood floors. A moment later, Sheriff Tillman appeared in the doorway of Thomas's study, his expression grim. "Thomas, Beatrice," he said with a nod, "I need to speak with you both about the situation we're facing." "How bad is it?" Thomas asked without preamble. "Bad enough. Jeb found their main camp and did some reconnaissance. We're looking at a coordinated operation designed to target the most valuable properties in the valley. Your bank, the Henderson store, Pete Morrison's new ranch operation. They've done their homework." Beatrice felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Are we in immediate danger?" "Not immediate, no, but they're clearly planning something significant, and when it happens, it's going to be designed to cause maximum disruption and economic damage." Buck's gaze shifted between Thomas and Beatrice. "Which brings me to why I'm here. We need to organize the community response, and that's going to require cooperation from everyone, including people who might have personal disagreements." The meaning was clear, and Thomas's jaw tightened. "You're asking me to work with Callahan. I'm asking you to put aside whatever objections you have to the man and recognize that he's our best chance of preventing a disaster." His scouting report is the difference between being prepared and being caught completely off guard. Thomas moved to his desk and sat heavily in his chair. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Town meeting tonight to coordinate our response. Jeb's agreed to share his intelligence and help plan our defensive strategy. But he made it clear that he won't participate if there's going to be personal conflict interfering with practical necessity." Beatrice understood the subtext immediately. Jeb was willing to help protect the community, but he wouldn't subject himself to hostility from her father while trying to keep everyone safe. "Father," she said quietly, "these people are threatening our home, our friends, everything we've built here. Whatever personal reservations you have about Jeb, surely they're less important than protecting the community." Thomas studied his daughter's face, perhaps recognizing that her concern went beyond simple civic duty. "You care about him," he said, finally. "This isn't just rebellion against my authority or romantic fascination with an unsuitable man. You genuinely care about what happens to him." "Yes," Beatrice replied simply. "I do." The admission hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than all the arguments and confrontations that had preceded it. For the first time, Thomas seemed to truly understand that his daughter's feelings were serious, adult emotions rather than adolescent defiance. "And he cares about you," Thomas continued, his voice thoughtful rather than angry. "I believe so." "Yes," Buck cleared his throat diplomatically. "Thomas, I know this is complicated, but we need a decision. The town meeting is in 3 hours, and people need to see leadership presenting a united front." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the street where townspeople were gathering in worried clusters. Finally, he looked at his daughter with an expression that held resignation, concern, and perhaps the beginning of acceptance. "Very well," he said. "I'll attend the meeting and I'll work with Callahan. But Beatrice, when this crisis is over, we're going to have a serious discussion about your future and what kind of life you really want." "I'd welcome that conversation, Father." As Buck left to continue his preparations, Beatrice remained in her father's study, both of them lost in thought about the challenges ahead. Outside, the community was rallying to face a threat that would test their courage, their unity, and their commitment to the life they'd built in this remote valley. But for Beatrice, the approaching crisis represented something else entirely. A chance to prove that she could be a partner rather than a burden. That her desire to belong to this frontier community wasn't just romantic fantasy, but genuine commitment to the place and people she'd come to love. As evening approached and the town prepared for the meeting that would determine their collective response to the claim jumpers' threat, Beatrice made a decision that would have shocked her Philadelphia finishing school instructors, but felt completely natural to the woman she was becoming. She would attend the meeting not as the banker's daughter, observing from the sidelines, but as a member of the community ready to do her part in its defense. And if that meant standing publicly beside Jeb Callahan and declaring her commitment to both him and the frontier life they might build together, then she was ready for whatever consequences that decision might bring. The pearl necklace her mother had given her years ago, a symbol of Eastern refinement and social position, lay in its velvet case on her dresser. Tomorrow, she decided, she would trade it to Henderson for supplies the town would need in the coming days. It was time to transform symbols of her past into tools for building her future. The town meeting that evening took place in the Silver Dollar Saloon, the only building in Cedar Ridge large enough to accommodate the entire community. Martha had cleared away the gaming tables and arranged chairs in rough rows, creating an improvised assembly hall where worried citizens gathered to hear Sheriff Tillman's report and Jeb's assessment of the threat they faced. Beatrice arrived with her father, wearing her practical dress and carrying herself with the quiet determination of someone who had made peace with a difficult decision. The room buzzed with nervous conversation as people speculated about the claim jumpers' intentions and debated various defensive strategies. When Jeb entered, the conversations gradually died away. He moved through the crowd with the contained alertness of a man accustomed to dangerous situations, nodding to familiar faces but maintaining the careful distance that had characterized his interactions with the community for 3 years. Sheriff Tillman called the meeting to order and quickly outlined the situation. Jeb spent 2 days tracking these men and gathering intelligence about their operation. What he found suggests we're facing a more sophisticated threat than simple claim jumping. Jeb stood and moved to the front of the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. "They've established 3 camps in a triangle around the valley," he began, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the saloon. "The main camp has 8 men, well armed and equipped for extended operations. The 2 smaller camps have 3 men each, lookouts positioned to monitor all traffic in and out of Cedar Ridge." A murmur of concern rippled through the crowd. Old Pete Morrison raised his hand. 14 men total? That's a small army for claim jumping." "That's what I thought too," Jeb replied. "So I did some more reconnaissance, got close enough to their main camp to overhear some conversations. What I learned changes everything. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Thomas. Linton, this isn't a random claim-jumping operation. They know specific details about property values, mortgage situations, and business relationships that they couldn't have gathered from casual observation. Thomas frowned. What kind of details? They know which ranchers are behind on loan payments. They know about the territorial government's plans for railroad development through this valley. They even know about private correspondence between local business owners and Eastern investors. The implications hit the room like cold water. Someone with access to confidential information was feeding intelligence to the claim jumpers, turning what should have been a straightforward defense against criminals into something far more sinister. You're suggesting we have a collaborator? Mayor Jameson said, his voice strained. I'm not suggesting it, Jeb replied grimly. I'm stating it as fact. They're being guided by someone who has intimate knowledge of this community's business affairs. Sheriff Tillman stepped forward. Did you hear any names mentioned? Any indication of who might be providing this information? Jeb hesitated, his expression troubled. They mentioned their contact by a code name only, someone they call the banker. The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the room turned toward Thomas Linton, who had gone white as fresh snow. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, poisoning the atmosphere with suspicion and doubt. Now wait just a minute, Thomas said, rising from his chair with obvious effort. If you're suggesting that I'm not suggesting anything about you personally, Jeb interrupted, though his tone was carefully neutral. I'm reporting what I heard. The question is whether someone else might be using your institution or your information without your knowledge. But the damage was already done. Beatrice could see it in the faces around the room. The doubt, the uncertainty, the way people were reassessing everything they thought they knew about her father's business practices. In a small community where trust was the foundation of all. Relationships, even the suggestion of betrayal, was devastating. Dr. Coleman leaned forward in his chair. Thomas, you must have records of everyone who's had access to loan information, property assessments, correspondence with territorial authorities. Of course I have records, Thomas replied sharply, but I'm not the only one in this territory. With access to such information, the Territorial Land Office, the county clerk, even the Postal Service handles confidential business correspondence. Martha Sullivan spoke up from behind the bar, her voice cutting through the growing tension. Arguing about who might be leaking information isn't going to help us deal with 14 armed men who want to steal our land. She was right, but Beatrice could see that the revelation had fundamentally changed the dynamics in the room. People were no longer simply worried about external threats. They were questioning whether they could trust their neighbors, their business partners, even their banker. As the meeting continued, with discussions of guard rotations and defensive positions, Beatrice found herself studying her father's face. She knew him well enough to recognize when he was hiding something, and his behavior tonight suggested there were aspects of this situation he hadn't shared. After the meeting dispersed into smaller groups making specific plans, she approached him near the back of the saloon. "Father," she said quietly, "we need to talk." Thomas glanced around the room, noting how many people were still watching him with suspicious eyes. Not here, too many ears, and apparently not all of them friendly. They walked back to the bank in silence, both lost in thought about the evening's revelations. Once inside Thomas's private office, with the door locked and curtains drawn, Beatrice confronted him directly. "You know something you didn't share at the meeting. What is it?" Thomas moved to his safe and withdrew a thick folder of documents. "I've been conducting some business that I haven't discussed with the community." "Business? That might be relevant to our current situation." He opened the folder and spread several legal documents across his desk. Beatrice could see they were land purchase agreements, survey reports, and correspondence with territorial authorities. "For the past 6 months, I've been quietly acquiring property options throughout the northern valleys," Thomas continued. "Working through intermediaries, using discretionary funds from my Philadelphia accounts." Beatrice stared at the documents, trying to process what she was seeing. You've been buying land? Why? Because the territorial government is planning to authorize railroad development through this region within the next 2 years. When that happens, property values will increase tenfold. The land I've optioned will be worth a fortune. The full implications of his revelation crashed over her like cold water. Father, are you saying I've been positioning our family to benefit from development that's coming whether we participate or not? Thomas interrupted firmly. I've done nothing illegal or unethical, but I have been gathering information and making strategic investments based on that information. Beatrice sat heavily in the chair across from his desk. The claim jumpers know about the railroad plans. They know which properties you've targeted. Father, don't you see what this looks like? It looks like someone with access to my private business affairs has been selling information to criminals, Thomas replied grimly. The question is who? Before Beatrice could respond, a soft knock at the office door interrupted them. Thomas opened it to find Lily standing in the hallway, her face pale with worry. Mr. Linton, there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent business related to tonight's meeting. Thomas exchanged glances with Beatrice, then followed Lily to the front of the bank. Standing in the main lobby, hat in hand, was a man neither of them recognized, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was accustomed to getting what he wanted. Mr. Linton, the stranger said with a slight bow, my name is William Hartley. I represent certain business interests from back east. I believe we need to have a conversation about your recent land acquisitions and the current difficulties with claim jumpers. Thomas stiffened. I'm afraid I don't understand what you're talking about, Mr. Hartley. Hartley smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. I think you understand perfectly. You see, Mr. Linton, my associates and I've been watching your activities in this territory with great interest. Your information about railroad development has been quite valuable to our operations. The truth hit Beatrice like a physical blow. The claim jumpers weren't being guided by a local collaborator. They were working for Eastern business interests, who had been using her father's intelligence gathering for their own criminal purposes. You've been monitoring my business correspondence, Thomas said, his voice tight with controlled fury. Monitoring, yes, and occasionally redirecting information to parties who could make better use of it than a small-town banker. Hartley's smile widened. You've been quite helpful, Mr. Linton, though I suspect not intentionally. You son of a— Now, Hartley interrupted smoothly. There's no need for unpleasantness. In fact, I'm here to offer you an opportunity to join our operation willingly. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for your land options and your continued cooperation. Beatrice stepped forward, her mind racing as she processed the full scope of the conspiracy they faced. And if he refuses, Hartley's gaze shifted to her with the calculating look of a predator evaluating potential prey. Miss Linton, isn't it? I've heard interesting things about you as well. Your association with the local mountain man has created quite a stir in certain circles. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Thomas moved protectively closer to his daughter, his hand reaching for the gun he kept in the desk drawer. I think this conversation is over, Mr. Hartley. Oh, I don't think so, Hartley replied calmly. You see, you're going to cooperate with us, Mr. Linton, because if you don't, we'll make sure the good people of Cedar Ridge learn exactly how their trusted banker has been profiting from information that led to their properties being targeted by claim jumpers. The elegant trap was now fully revealed. Thomas had been manipulated into gathering intelligence that was used to threaten his own community, and now his choices were limited to cooperation or public disgrace. But as Hartley outlined the terms of his partnership, neither he nor Thomas noticed Beatrice slipping quietly toward the back door. The man threatening her father had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the determination of a woman who had found something worth fighting for. Within minutes, she was running through the dark streets of Cedar Ridge, her practical boots carrying her swiftly toward the Morrison cabin, where she prayed Jeb would still be awake. The community needed to know the truth about who they were, really fighting, and more importantly, they needed to know it before Hartley's employers could complete whatever plan they had set in motion. The war for Cedar Ridge was about to begin, but at least now they would know who their real enemies were. Beatrice's frantic run through the moonlit wilderness to reach Jeb at the Morrison cabin marked the beginning of the most harrowing night in Cedar Ridge's brief history. When she burst through the cabin door, breathless and wild-eyed, Jeb was already reaching for his rifle, the weapon his father had passed down to him, a constant reminder of the responsibilities that came with protecting those you cared about. "They're not just claim jumpers," she gasped, fighting to catch her breath. "They're working for Eastern business interests. My father's been manipulated." Jeb was on his feet instantly, his military training evident in the way he moved from relaxation to full alertness in seconds. "Slow down, Beatrice. Tell me everything." As she explained about Hartley's visit and the revelation that Thomas had unknowingly provided intelligence to the very criminals threatening their community, Jeb's expression grew increasingly grim. This wasn't the straightforward conflict he'd prepared for. It was a complex conspiracy that turned neighbors against each other and made it impossible to know who could be trusted. "How much time do we have?" he asked, already moving to gather his gear. "I don't know." Hartley seemed confident that he could force Father's cooperation, but he doesn't know Father the way I do. Thomas Linton doesn't respond well to threats, especially when they involve his family. Jeb paused in his preparations and looked at her directly. "Beatrice, what you've done tonight, coming to warn me, choosing to trust me with this information instead of protecting your father's reputation, that took real courage. It's my community too, Jeb. These are my friends, my home, whatever mistakes Father made. They were manipulated by people who saw an opportunity to exploit his ambition." The sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Jeb moved to the window, his rifle ready, then relaxed slightly as he recognized the riders. "It's Buck and 3 of his deputies," he reported. "Looks like word's already spreading." Sheriff Tillman entered the cabin with the controlled urgency of a man who dealt with enough crises to know that panic was more dangerous than any external threat. Behind him came Deputy Williams, Pete Morrison, and Dr. Coleman, men who represented the core leadership of Cedar Ridge's civic structure. "Jeb, Beatrice, we've got a problem," Buck announced without preamble. "Thomas Linton's disappeared. Lily found signs of a struggle in the bank, and there's a note saying he's been taken as insurance against community interference." Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. "Hartley took him? Who's Hartley?" Buck demanded, as Beatrice quickly explained the evening's revelations. The men's expressions reflected her own growing horror at the scope of the conspiracy they faced. This wasn't simply a matter of defending against claim jumpers. It was a coordinated attack on their entire way of life, orchestrated by people with resources and connections that extended far beyond the Montana territory. "They've been planning this for months," Pete Morrison said grimly, "using Thomas's information to identify the most valuable targets, then positioning themselves to either steal everything or force us into partnerships that would strip us of control over our own property." Dr. Coleman shook his head in disbelief. "But why take such elaborate measures? Surely there are easier ways to acquire frontier property." "Not property that's about to increase in value due to railroad development," Jeb replied. "If they can control the prime locations before the railroad comes through, they'll have a monopoly on the most profitable businesses in the territory." Buck moved to the cabin's crude map table, where Jeb had been planning defensive positions. "All right, let's think this through tactically. They have Thomas as leverage, 14 armed men in known positions, and apparently unlimited resources from their eastern backers. What are our advantages?" "We know the terrain," Jeb said immediately. "We know where they're camped, and we have the community's support." More importantly, they're expecting us to react defensively. They've planned for siege tactics and intimidation, not for an organized offensive. You're suggesting we attack rather than defend? Deputy Williams asked. I'm suggesting we do what they least expect. Take the fight to them before they can implement whatever final phase they have planned. Beatrice stepped forward, her mind racing as she processed the strategic implications. There's something else. Hartley was very confident about Father's cooperation, but he also seemed to be working under time pressure. Whatever they're planning, it has to happen soon, or the opportunity will pass. The Territorial Land Commissioner is scheduled to arrive next week for the quarterly property assessments, Dr. Coleman said suddenly. If they're planning to file fraudulent claims, they need to do it before his visit. Jeb nodded grimly. Which means they'll move tomorrow, probably at dawn. Classic tactical timing. Catch the community while they're still asleep. Present the land commissioner with a fait accompli when he arrives. The next few hours became a blur of preparation and planning. Riders were dispatched to alert every household in the valley, while Jeb and Buck coordinated defensive positions and offensive strategies. The community's response was swift and determined. Whatever doubts people might have had about Thomas Linton's business practices, they understood that their survival depended on standing together against the external threat. Martha Sullivan arrived at the cabin near midnight, bringing food and ammunition. The whole town's awake, she reported. Women and children are being moved to the church basement, and every man who can hold a rifle is ready to fight. What about morale? Buck asked. Angry as hornets, Martha replied with grim satisfaction. Turns out people don't much like being manipulated by Eastern businessmen who think frontier folks are too stupid to manage their own affairs. As dawn approached, Beatrice found herself facing the most difficult decision of her life. The plan Jeb and Buck had developed called for a coordinated attack on the claim jumpers' camps, but it also required someone to attempt negotiating for Thomas's release, a role that would put that person in extreme danger. I should be the one to approach them, she announced, as the final preparations were being made. I'm Thomas's daughter, and Hartley specifically mentioned me. He'll be expecting some kind of family response to Father's kidnapping. Absolutely not, Jeb said firmly. It's too dangerous, and we can't risk losing you too. Listen to me, Beatrice insisted, her voice carrying the authority she'd learned from months of Martha's practical education. Hartley thinks I'm a pampered Eastern lady who can be intimidated or manipulated. He won't see me as a real threat until it's too late. Buck studied her face with the calculating look of a lawman evaluating an asset. What exactly are you proposing? Let me approach their main camp under a flag of truce. While I'm distracting them with negotiations, you and Jeb can position your men for the coordinated attack. They'll be focused on me, not watching for your approach. The risk, Jeb began. The risk is acceptable, Beatrice interrupted, because the alternative is letting them execute whatever plan they have for Father and the community. Besides, I'm not planning to go in defenseless. She opened her cloak to reveal one of Martha's sharp kitchen knives concealed in her belt, along with a small derringer that Dr. Coleman had insisted she carry. You've thought this through, Buck said with grudging admiration. I've been thinking about it all night. Hartley underestimated me once. He thinks I'm a weakness Father will do anything to protect. Let's use that assumption against him. Jeb moved close to her, his hands settling on her shoulders with gentle firmness. Beatrice, if something goes wrong, if you're hurt or captured, I'll never forgive myself for agreeing to this. Then don't let something go wrong, she replied, reaching up to touch his face. You're the best scout and tactician in the territory. I trust you to keep me safe while I do my part. The exchange that followed was brief but intense. A kiss that spoke of promises, fears, and the kind of desperate hope that comes with facing an uncertain future together. When they broke apart, both had tears in their eyes, but their resolve was unshaken. 1 hour, Buck said, checking his pocket watch. That's how long you have to keep them distracted. After that, we attack whether the negotiation is finished or not. As Beatrice prepared for what might be the last hour of her life, she felt an odd sense of peace settling over her. For months, she'd felt trapped between two worlds, the refined Eastern life her father wanted for her and the authentic frontier existence that called to her spirit. Now, finally, she had the chance to prove that she belonged in the world she'd chosen, that she could be a partner rather than a burden to the man she loved and the community she'd come to call home. The ride to the claim jumpers' main camp took her through country that had become familiar over her weeks of practical education with Martha. She'd learned to read the landscape, to move quietly through wilderness terrain, to observe and assess without being detected. Skills that had seemed like romantic adventure when she first sought them out now carried the weight of life and death necessity. The camp was exactly where Jeb had said it would be, nestled in a valley that provided good, defensive positions but also, as she now realized, limited escape routes. The men she could see moving around the campfires looked professional and well-equipped, but they also looked confident to the point of complacency. They believed they held all the advantages, that they were dealing with unsophisticated frontier. Folk who could be easily intimidated or outmaneuvered. As she approached the camp's perimeter under a white flag, improvised from her silk scarf, Beatrice caught sight of her father. Thomas was tied to a tree near the largest tent, but he appeared unharmed and alert. When he saw her approaching, his expression shifted from relief to horror as he realized she was putting herself in danger for his sake. "Miss Linton," called. A familiar voice. Hartley emerged from the main tent, flanked by two armed men. "How good of you to join us, though I must say your timing is rather inconvenient." "Mr. Hartley," she replied, maintaining the calm, refined tone that would reinforce his impression of her as a sheltered young woman. "I've come to discuss terms for my father's release." "Terms?" Hartley laughed, but there was something forced about his amusement. "My dear girl, you're hardly in a position to negotiate terms. Your father's cooperation is no longer optional." As she moved closer to the camp's center, Beatrice used her peripheral vision to assess the defensive positions and guard rotations that Jeb would need to know about. The men were well armed but relaxed, confident that their hostage guaranteed their safety. "Perhaps we could discuss this more privately," she suggested, gesturing toward the main tent. "I believe I have information that might interest your employers." The suggestion seemed to intrigue Hartley, who gestured for her to follow him into the tent. Once inside, away from the other men's hearing, his demeanor shifted subtly. "What information could you possibly have that would interest my associates?" "Information about additional properties that haven't been included in your acquisition plans," Beatrice replied smoothly. "Father's been more thorough in his intelligence gathering than you realize." It was a bluff, but one calculated to buy time, while Jeb and Buck moved into position. As Hartley questioned her about imaginary property assessments and fictitious business correspondence, Beatrice kept track of the time and listened for any sounds that might indicate the attack was beginning. "You're stalling," Hartley said suddenly, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "This conversation is designed to keep me distracted while your mountain man friend attempts some sort of rescue." The accusation hit too close to home for Beatrice to maintain her innocent facade. "Perhaps," she admitted, "but you should ask yourself why I would risk my life just to buy time for a rescue attempt." "Why would you?" "Because sometimes, Mr. Hartley, people underestimate what frontier women are capable of when they're defending their homes and the people they love." As if her words were a signal, the sound of gunfire erupted from the camp's perimeter. Jeb's coordinated attack had begun, and the next few minutes would determine whether Cedar Ridge remained free or fell under the control of distant businessmen who saw its people as nothing more than obstacles to profit. Hartley reached for his weapon, but Beatrice was already moving, Martha's practical education about decisive action serving her better than any finishing school lesson ever had. The kitchen knife appeared in her hand, as if by magic, And suddenly the pampered banker's daughter was gone, replaced by a frontier woman fighting for everything that mattered to her. The battle for Cedar Ridge had begun, and Beatrice Linton was no longer watching from the sidelines. The town bell of Cedar Ridge began to ring with the urgent, irregular rhythm that every frontier community used to signal danger. The bronze bell, mounted in the small tower beside the church, had been donated by the territorial government 5 years earlier as a symbol of civilization's arrival in the wilderness. Now its voice carried across the valley with desperate authority, calling every able-bodied person to defend their home against those who would steal it through fraud and violence. Martha Sullivan stood beside the bell tower, her weathered hands pulling the rope with methodical determination while her sharp eyes scanned the horizon for signs of the battle she knew was raging at the claim jumpers' camp. Around her, the women and children of Cedar Ridge huddled in the church basement, while every man who could hold a weapon had either joined Jeb's assault or taken defensive positions throughout the town. The sound of gunfire from the northern valley confirmed that the attack was underway, but Martha knew that the real test would come when Hartley's men realized they were facing a coordinated offensive rather than a simple rescue attempt. These weren't desperate farmers with hunting rifles. They were professional criminals with military-grade weapons and the ruthless training to use them effectively. At the claim jumpers' main camp, Beatrice's confrontation with Hartley had erupted into deadly violence the moment the first shots rang out. Her kitchen knife had found its target with the precision that Martha's practical education had drilled into her. Not the killing blow of a trained assassin, but the kind of decisive, survival-focused attack that frontier women learned when civilization's protection was miles away and help might never come. Hartley stumbled backward, clutching his wounded arm, while his other hand reached for the pistol at his belt. "You little—" "The little what?" Beatrice demanded, her voice carrying the cold fury of someone who had finally stopped pretending to be something she wasn't. "The little Eastern lady who was supposed to be too refined and delicate to fight back? The little banker's daughter who was supposed to collapse in terror at the first sign of real danger?" Before Hartley could draw his weapon, the tent flap burst open and Thomas Linton stumbled inside, his hands still bound but his face blazing with paternal rage. One of the camp guards lay motionless outside, and the rope that had secured Thomas to the tree was cut cleanly, evidence that Jeb's assault had been precisely timed to create maximum confusion. "Get away from my daughter," Thomas growled, his banker's dignity replaced by something far more primitive and dangerous: the chaos. Outside, the tent was growing more intense as Jeb's coordinated attack pressed home its advantages. The claim jumpers had prepared for siege defense and intimidation tactics, but they hadn't anticipated a frontal assault by men who knew every rock, tree, and game trail in the surrounding wilderness. Jeb himself moved through the camp with the fluid competence of someone whose military training had never really left him, despite 3 years of mountain solitude. The rifle his father had passed down to him spoke with deadly accuracy, and his tactical decisions were those of a man who understood that the difference between victory and defeat often came down to seconds and inches. "Thompson, Williams, flank. Left around those rocks," he called to Buck's deputies. "Pete, keep them pinned down behind the supply wagons. Don't let them reorganize." The claim jumpers were professional criminals, but they were also men who had grown accustomed to intimidating opponents rather than fighting them. The ferocity and coordination of the Cedar Ridge assault caught them off guard, and their initial defensive positions began to crumble under pressure they hadn't expected to face. Back in the main tent, Hartley was bleeding freely from Beatrice's knife wound, but desperation had made him more dangerous rather than less. With his good hand, he finally managed to draw his pistol and point it at Thomas. "Call off your attack," he snarled, "or I'll put a bullet in your father's brain." Beatrice felt time slow down as she assessed her options. The derringer Dr. Coleman had insisted she carry was in easy reach, but using it would mean accepting The possibility that she might have to kill a man to save her father's life. 6 months ago, such a thought would have been unimaginable. Now, it felt like a natural extension of the woman she had become. "You're going to die either way, Mr. Hartley," she said calmly, her hand moving to the small weapon. "The question is whether you die as a coward who threatens helpless prisoners, or as someone who at least faces the consequences of his choices." "I'm not dying at all," Hartley replied, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. The pampered, Eastern lady he'd expected to intimidate had been replaced by someone he didn't recognize, someone whose eyes held the kind of determination that made experienced criminals nervous. The sound of approaching footsteps outside the tent announced the arrival of more combatants, but it was impossible to tell whether they were Hartley's reinforcements or Jeb's assault team. In the enclosed space of the tent, with a wounded criminal, pointing a gun at her father, Beatrice realized that all of her months of practical education and frontier adaptation had been leading to this moment. The point where she would have to prove definitively which world she belonged to and what she was willing to do to protect it. The town bell continued to ring in the distance, its bronze voice carrying across the Montana wilderness with the urgent message that Cedar Ridge was fighting for its survival. And in a blood-stained tent, where two very different visions of frontier life faced each other with deadly intent, Beatrice Linton prepared to make the choice that would define not just her own future, but the future of everyone she had come to love. The tent flap exploded inward with the force of Jeb's entry, his rifle leading the way as he assessed the deadly tableau before him in a single glance. Hartley with a gun pointed at Thomas, Beatrice holding her derringer with the steady hands of someone who had made peace with what she might have to do, and blood on the ground that spoke of violence already committed. "Let him go, Hartley," Jebby said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had faced down armed enemies in circumstances far more desperate than this. "Your operation's finished. Half your men are dead or captured, and the other half are running for their lives." "Are they?" Hartley replied, though his confidence was clearly shaken by the sounds of battle outside. "Because it seems to me I still hold the winning card." He pressed his pistol more firmly against Thomas's temple, and Beatrice saw her father's jaw tighten. With the kind of controlled anger that had made him successful in frontier banking, but might now get him killed by a desperate criminal. "You're not thinking clearly," Jeb continued, never taking his eyes off Hartley's gun hand. "Even if you kill Thomas, you're still trapped in a tent surrounded by people who want you dead. Even if you somehow escape this camp, you're in the middle of wilderness that will kill you long before you reach civilization. Your only real choice is how you want to die, quickly and cleanly, or slowly and painfully after days of wandering lost in country you don't understand." During this exchange, Beatrice noticed something that neither man had seen, a small movement in the shadows behind Hartley, where the tent wall met the ground. Someone was cutting through the canvas, and judging by the careful, methodical nature of the work, it wasn't one of Hartley's allies. She forced herself to keep her expression neutral while maintaining her grip on the derringer. If Hartley suspected additional rescue attempts were underway, he might panic and pull the trigger before anyone could stop him. "What I understand," Hartley said with growing desperation, "is that your frontier community has interfered with a legitimate business operation. My employers have invested considerable resources in this territory, and they expect returns on that investment." "Your employers?" Thomas spoke for the first time since Jeb's arrival, his voice tight with suppressed fury. "Are thieves and cowards who hide behind legal technicalities and hired guns because they lack the courage to build anything of value themselves." The words hit Hartley like physical blows, perhaps because they contained too much truth for comfortable dismissal. His face flushed with anger, and Beatrice saw his grip on the pistol tighten dangerously. "Shut up, old man. You've been useful, but your usefulness has limits, as does your patience, apparently." said a new voice from behind Hartley. Sheriff Buck Tillman rose from the tent floor where he'd completed cutting through the canvas wall, his own weapon trained on the back of Hartley's head. "Drop the gun, son, it's over." For a moment the tableau held. 4 people in a space barely large enough for 2, each calculating odds and consequences, while the sounds of the ending battle filtered through the tent walls. Outside, the gunfire was becoming more sporadic, suggesting that Jeb's coordinated assault had achieved its objectives. Hartley's eyes darted between the 3 weapons pointed at him, and Beatrice could see the exact moment when he realized that his situation was hopeless. But rather than surrender, he made the choice that desperate men often make when cornered. He decided that if he couldn't win, he would at least take someone with him. His finger began to tighten on the trigger, and Beatrice felt the world slow down as she realized that talking was over. The time for civilization, negotiation, and reasonable compromise had passed. This was the moment Martha had prepared her for, when survival depended on the kind of decisive action that Eastern finishing schools never taught. She pulled the trigger of her derringer. The small weapons report was sharp and final in the enclosed space, and Hartley's pistol discharged harmlessly into the tent roof as he spun away from Thomas and collapsed to the ground. The wound was serious but not immediately fatal. Beatrice had aimed to disable rather than kill, guided by an instinct for mercy that seemed almost miraculous under the circumstances. "Jesus," Buck breathed, lowering his rifle as he surveyed the scene. "Remind me never to underestimate bankers' daughters." Jeb immediately moved to Thomas, checking for injuries while Buck secured Hartley's weapons. "You all right, sir?" "I'm fine," Thomas replied, though his hands shook slightly as Jeb cut the ropes that bound him. "Thanks to my daughter's practical education." He looked at Beatrice with an expression that held pride, concern, and a new kind of respect that acknowledged she was no longer the sheltered young woman he'd tried so hard to protect. "Beatrice," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I thought I was keeping you safe by keeping you contained, but I was really just keeping you from becoming the person you were meant to be." Before she could respond, Jeb reached into his vest pocket and withdrew something small, the original wedding ring from his first marriage, which he'd worn for 3 years as both remembrance and barrier against new love. Without ceremony, he slipped it from his finger and set it on the tent's makeshift table. "I don't need this anymore," he said simply, looking directly at Beatrice. "I'm ready to build something new." The gesture was more meaningful than any formal proposal could have been, a public acknowledgement that he was finally ready to open his heart completely and trust in a future they would create together. As they emerged from the tent into the Montana sunshine, where the surviving claim jumpers were being secured by Buck's deputies and the threat to Cedar Ridge was finally ended, Beatrice realized that everything had changed. She was no longer caught between 2 worlds. She had found her place in the one she'd chosen, proven her worth to the community she loved, and earned the right to build the kind of life that honored both her Eastern education and her frontier spirit. The battle was over, but the real adventure, building a life and love that bridged 2 worlds, was just beginning. 6 months later, the wooden sign hanging outside what had once been Henderson's general store read Callahan and Associates General Store in carefully painted letters that caught the morning light. The Associates part of the name reflected both Beatrice's partnership in the business and Jeb's integration into the community's commercial life, a development that would have seemed impossible during his hermit years, but now felt as natural as the changing seasons. The wedding had taken place on a crisp December morning, with the entire population of Cedar Ridge gathered in the church that had sheltered their families during the claim jumpers' attack. Martha Sullivan had served as matron of honor, her weather-beaten and steady, as she helped Beatrice arrange the simple but elegant dress she'd sewn herself from fabric ordered specially from San Francisco. Thomas Linton had walked his daughter down the aisle with visible pride, no longer the controlling father trying to protect a sheltered daughter, but a man who had learned to respect the woman his child had become. The transformation in their relationships had been gradual but profound. Thomas had discovered that supporting his daughter's choices, rather than opposing them, brought them closer together than years of well-intentioned control ever had. He'd also found that Jeb's practical intelligence and wilderness skills complemented his own business acumen in ways that benefited the entire community's economic development. The general store itself reflected this new partnership between different kinds of expertise. Where Henderson had focused primarily on basic supplies and farming equipment, Callahan and Associates offered a carefully curated selection of goods that served both practical frontier needs and the more refined requirements of a community growing in sophistication and prosperity. Beatrice stood behind the counter on this particular morning, reviewing inventory records with the same attention to detail she'd once applied to needlework and French literature. Her transformation from pampered heiress to capable businesswoman had been complete, but not absolute. She still maintained the refined speech and gracious manners that marked her Eastern education, but now they were integrated with practical skills and genuine understanding of frontier life. "The Territorial Land Commissioner's due in this afternoon," Jeb announced as he entered through the store's back door, carrying supplies from their expanded storage building. "Buck wants to make sure all our property documentation is in order before he reviews the aftermath of the Hartley situation." The legal resolution of the claim jumpers' conspiracy had taken months to sort through, involving territorial authorities, federal marshals, and even congressional inquiry into the corrupt business practices that had enabled the scheme. Hartley himself had recovered from his gunshot wound, only to face federal charges that would likely keep him imprisoned for decades. His Eastern employers had largely escaped direct prosecution, but their reputation in territorial development had been destroyed, and several related enterprises had collapsed under the weight of public scandal. "Everything's ready," Beatrice replied, gesturing to a neat stack of documents on the counter. Property deeds, business licenses, even the correspondence trail that proves father's unwitting involvement rather than deliberate collaboration. The vindication of Thomas Linton's reputation had been important not just for family pride, but for the community's economic stability. A banker under federal suspicion would have been unable to continue serving Cedar Ridge's financial needs, and finding a replacement would have been difficult, if not impossible. "How's the railroad survey progressing?" she asked, knowing that Jeb had been working with the territorial engineers to map the most practical route through their valley. "Better than expected. The route they're planning will bring the main line within 2 miles of town, close enough for economic benefit, but far enough away to preserve the community character folks value." This balance between progress and preservation had become a recurring theme in Cedar Ridge's development. The community had learned from the claim jumpers' conspiracy that external development could be either opportunity or threat, depending on whether local people maintained control over their own destiny. A knock at the store's front door interrupted their conversation. Through the glass, they could see a familiar figure, Pete Morrison, whose ranch had expanded significantly since the resolution of the claim jumpers' threat. Behind him stood a woman neither of them recognized, well-dressed but wearing the kind of practical clothing that suggested she understood frontier requirements. "Morning, Pete," Jeb called as he opened the door. "What brings you to town?" "Jeb, Beatrice, I'd like you to meet my niece, Sarah Morrison. She's come out from Chicago to help with the ranch expansion and maybe start a school if there's enough interest." Sarah Morrison proved to be an educated, capable woman in her 30s, who had grown tired of city life and sought the kind of authentic existence that frontier communities could provide. Her arrival represented a broader trend. More people from eastern cities were choosing frontier life not as a last resort or get-rich-quick scheme, but as a conscious decision to build meaningful lives in places where individual contribution mattered. "We'd certainly welcome a proper school," Beatrice said warmly. "The children have been making do with informal lessons." but a trained teacher would make an enormous difference. As Pete and Sarah continued their tour of the town, Jeb and Beatrice returned to their work, but both were thinking about the larger implications of what they'd witnessed. Cedar Ridge was no longer simply surviving. It was thriving in ways that honored both practical necessity and civilized aspiration. "Do you ever regret it?" Jeb asked quietly as they worked side by side arranging merchandise. "Giving up the kind of life your father originally planned for you?" Beatrice paused in her work and looked around the store they'd built together, the physical embodiment of their partnership and their commitment to the community they served. Through the front windows, she could see the bustling activity of a town that had found its footing, where people moved with purpose and confidence rather than the desperate urgency of simple survival. "I didn't give up anything, Jeb. I traded one life for a better one." She moved closer to him, taking his hands in hers. "I traded security for adventure, comfort for meaning, and solitude for love, even when that love comes with risks. When the man you married still prefers mountains to drawing rooms, especially." "Then," she replied with a smile that held all the warmth and determination that had first attracted him to her, "because the risks are worth it, and the mountains taught you how to build something that lasts." As afternoon sunlight streamed through the store's windows, illuminating the life they'd created together from the foundation of an impulsive prank that had triggered unexpected love, Beatrice reflected on how the smallest moments truly could create the biggest changes. Sometimes, she thought, the best adventures begin when you stop watching life from behind glass and decide to join in, regardless of where that decision might lead. Outside, the town bell rang the hour with the same bronze voice that had called the community to defend itself 6 months earlier. But now its sound spoke not of danger, but of time passing peacefully in a place where people had learned to balance dreams with reality, and where love had proven strong enough to bridge the gap between two very different worlds.